Today we're going to be doing a thrift flip for beginners. We're going to be tackling 3 things that I think every beginner sewer should learn to do. The first is hemming, the second is sewing buttons and buttonholes, and the third is going to be repositioning a side seam or just basic seam construction. If you're interested in how to do this DIY, then just keep watching.
To begin, this is the original garment that I'll be working from in this video. It is a long line cardigan I picked up from my local thrift store. Originally the piece is from Gap. I'm not a big fan of how long it is, so that's why I decided to turn it into a cropped cardigan and make a few other modifications as well. Our first step is going to be marking where we want the cropped length to be. I'm marking down from the waist on my dress form and carrying that same distance over to the other side and marking it with pins. After taking the garment off of my dress form, I started to mark my seam allowance. I did want the back to be slightly longer, so I gave myself an extra inch of length there, and then marked 5/8 seam allowance from the top pin line in the front to my new measured length in the back. So this line that I'm drawing is 5/8 of an inch below my pin line in the front and 1 5/8 of an inch below my pin line in the back. Once you're done marking, go ahead and cut that line, and your new cropped garment should look something like this. After cropping, I do recommend trying it on. This is how mine looked, and I was happy with my length, so I also pinned the front panels together to simulate where I wanted the buttons to eventually go.
I didn't actually need to reshape my neckline at all because my original piece had a very straight opening, so I was able to just pin it together and it kind of draws it into a V shape.
Once you're happy with the length of your crop, you can take the bottom portion that we cut off earlier and open it up so we can take the existing binding off of this piece. My binding was about 1 inch in height, so I cut 2 inches from the bottom of the garment to be able to have some extra material for seam allowance. I realized after I had cut the piece that my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance was going to be negligible. If I wanted to maintain that, I would have only cut 5/8 of an inch from the narrow binding instead of 1 inch, but the extra length didn't bother me too much. Moving on, we're taking the cropped bodice piece and laying it out flat with the right side facing up towards us, and we're going to pin that new binding piece that we just cut right sides together with the existing bodice piece. I am making sure that the narrow rib knit is at the top, so when we sew along the seam and fold it down, it is aligning with the bottom of the garment. I'm making sure that I am pinning the side seams of our binding to the side seams of our bodice piece so that we have one continuous connection from the top bodice of the garment to our new hem.
Just as you sew different materials under your machine, there are different needles and different presser feet to use for specific materials. Since I am sewing a sweater knit, I am using a jersey needle or stretch needle, same thing, or ballpoint needle. They basically have a rounded tip as opposed to a normal sewing needle, which is more pointed, so it kind of falls in between the weave instead of splitting it with a sharper point. I'm also using a walking foot, which in my experience when sewing knits helps because it has the feed dogs, which push your fabric through the machine on, you have it on the bottom of your presser plate, which is just built into your machine, and then for a walking foot, it's also on the top of the foot. So you have 2 feet that are pushing and walking along on the fabric, which helps to prevent pulling that can happen with a standard sewing foot. And when you're working with a stretchy material, that can lead to puckering. So to avoid that, I do recommend using a walking foot.
With that said, I have my fabric under my machine with the binding pinned to the bodice piece, and I'm going to sew in between the channel where the narrow rib knit and the chunkier sweater knit meet. This is because I want a clean transition from the 2 different densities, and I don't want to have a seam and then another transition. I'm using a zigzag stitch with a length of 2 and a width of 4, and I am backstitching at the front and back of the seam, taking out the pins as I go along.
knows what I've been through, but this is the end of me and you. Set your mind free. Made a promise to myself this time I will keep.
After sewing, I eyeballed about 1/4 of an inch away from the seam that I just sewed and cut off the extra fabric. You may notice I'm not finishing the seams. That's because the material that I'm sewing with is a sweater knit and it will eventually curl over on itself, so I didn't feel that it needed to have finished seams on the inside.
If you have an interest in finishing the seams, I will leave some links down below for some information on how to do that. But is it necessary? I don't think so. At least not in this case.
After taking my garment off the machine, this is something that I like to do regularly with top threads, is bring them to the back and tie them off on the wrong side of the fabric. It's called burying your threads. I find that if you just cut it on the top side, you can end up with a little stub of a thread and it kind of sticks out. But if you bring it to the back and tie it in a knot, it's completely hidden, and that's never an issue.
I know I should. You cast your spell and now and under. I know the laughter and the pain. Will I ever love again?
Now we're moving on to the buttonholes, but I promise you they are not as scary as you might think. I had originally pinned my 2 front panels together when I was trying it on for my cropped length, so I did that again and marked it with pins that I could transfer to chalk marks. And with the 3 buttons, I positioned the top button where I wanted the front closure to start, and my bottom button is at the center of the binding, and then the middle button is just splitting the difference between those 2. I'm carrying that chalk line over from one side of the garment to the other, so I know where to position the buttons and where to position the buttonholes to line up together. My buttons measured 3/4 of an inch in diameter, so I wanted my buttonholes to be at least an inch. I marked 1/2 an inch from that center line, as you see on the right, on the top and bottom, to mark the top and bottom of my buttonhole, and then marked a vertical line to measure the exact center of that binding. So a corded buttonhole is almost a necessity for this type of material. After trial and error on my scrap pieces, I realized that a normal buttonhole was just leading to fraying and unraveling of the knit, but a corded buttonhole acts as a reinforcement around the hole once it's cut open, so that we don't have any rogue threads coming undone. I will leave the link to the tutorial that I used to learn how to do this in the description bar down below, but I did not find that it was any more difficult than a normal buttonhole, and it looks a lot cleaner as well. Once I finished sewing my buttonholes, I started to bury my buttonhole cords and my top threads on the wrong side of the fabric to finish off the clean look.
Time goes by and yet I wonder, why do we put each other through hell? Why can't we just get over ourselves? I know I should. You cast your spell and now and under. I know the laughter and the pain. Will I ever love again?
When I was marking my buttonholes, I transferred over that horizontal line to mark where the center of the buttonhole was, where I knew I wanted my button to be. And I also added a perpendicular vertical line that marked the center of the binding and just sewed the buttons at that crosshair section.
And I repeat, and in my head, set your mind free. Set your mind.
Whenever I sew buttons, I like to flip them over when I'm done and kind of run my needle back and forth a few times in different directions to secure it and essentially knot it in place. And then I just trim it off like so.
This is where we come to a bit of a crossroads. I had tried on the piece after cropping it and sewing the buttons on, and it was super boxy and I hated it. So my solution was to take it in at the side seams, the current side seams, and basically taper it from the armpit of the garment all the way down. I just stood there and pinched it and estimated about 2.5 inches would be a good starting point. Of course, you can always sew the seam, try it on, and then move it if you have to, but I figured 2.5 is a good starting point. So that's what I'm starting with.
I took my garment and flipped it right sides together, exposing the inside side seam. I then marked 2.5 inches with a pin from that seam and put a second pin up at the junction between the side seam and the armhole. This way we can ensure that the seam tapers off right underneath the armhole and essentially disappears. Just before sewing, I connected the bottom pin and top pin with a line and chalk to make sure that I could sew perfectly straight from the bottom hem up to that point by the armhole. If you notice that I'm not backstitching, it's because I didn't. I was thinking that I was sewing a dart because it's angled and comes to a point like a dart, when in fact it's a side seam, so I definitely recommend that you backstitch at the front and back. I ended up just tying it off and it worked perfectly fine. If you're ever going to move your fabric around under your machine, make sure your needle is down. You can see here I move it and my needle's up and it misaligns my seam. Definitely have the needle down if you're going to adjust fabric. If you had backstitched this seam, then this wouldn't be necessary, but I am tying my thread since I didn't backstitch in a knot to secure and prevent everything from unraveling. After trying on my garment with this new seam, I was happy with how it fit, so I went ahead and cut 1/4 inch away from that seam, the extra material, and just cleaned it up with some scissors since I'm not finishing the inside seam in any other way, and that's it. We get down, down to the beat, y'all. We get down to the beat, y'all. It's like we're not going anywhere. Maybe it's because there's something in the air. And I don't even care, no, no. I don't even care anymore. It's like
Thank you guys for sticking around to the end of this video. If you have anything you'd like to see from me in the future, leave your suggestions down below. I hope that this inspires you to tackle the thrift store or even just go shopping in your own closet. Don't forget to like and subscribe to be able to follow all future thrift flips and DIYs on this channel. Bye!
it's like we're not going anywhere. Maybe it's because there's something in the air.